There's no shortage of great modern tool watches and dive watches. We talk about a lot of them on here, but there's always one era that we look back at quite fondly as perhaps the pinnacle of modern tool watches. And that's kind of the mid to late 90s, maybe early 2000s. And today we're talking about one of the watches from that era that I think is very emblematic of why we love them. My name is Blake Bettner. I'm the managing editor of Worn & Wound, and today we're talking about the Omega Seamaster 300, reference 2231.50. This is a titanium Seamaster that belongs to the first generation of the Seamaster 300 that was first released in 1983, replacing the Seamaster 200. This is a full titanium version of the Seamaster that came in the early 2000s. There were 3 titanium Seamaster 300s that were released. This one, the 2231.80 with a blue dial and a polished bezel, and then 150th anniversary edition, the 2232.30 with a gray dial and a white gold bezel insert. This is the simplest and perhaps purest execution of the titanium Seamaster 300, especially of this generation. And being late in the generation, this utilizes the caliber 1120, which is of course the base ETA 2892A2. This is a chronometer rated version of it in here. So there's a few things in there that we can unpack. I want to start with the design of this watch. It is very emblematic of the era. Of course, the first generation Seamaster is from the early 90s, kind of rose to prominence in the mid 90s, appearing on the wrist of a character named James Bond that you may be familiar with. And then from there, we've of course associated this watch with James Bond character, as he's worn quite a few models. Omega has released quite a few limited editions commemorating this fact. This watch kind of puts all that aside though, and kind of embraces everything that made the first generation Seamaster 300 so great. And being entirely in titanium only kind of heightens all of these things a little bit further. This is not the most common reference of the Seamaster 300, but to me it's everything that made this particular watch great. Of course, it is titanium, it's light, 41 millimeters in diameter, it's about 47 millimeters from lug to lug, and around 12 millimeters in thickness. But this is a watch that kind of forces you to set the numbers aside, because once you put it on your wrist, it kind of disappears in a way that modern Seamaster 300s do not. And there's a few reasons for that, namely the way in which the case is profiled along the side here. It kind of tapers into a pretty thin case wall, but more importantly, the helium escape valve, which is of course something that we associate with a modern Seamaster 300. The way that it's been implemented here, though, is a far more low profile manner compared to modern Seamaster 300s, and it makes a big difference on the wrist, as well as just looking at it from the top down. It's not distracting to the focal point of the watch at all. It's kind of relegated to neat detail status, rather than what the heck is that thing doing there. The dial of this watch references some classic Seamaster dive watches from the 60s. Of course, this is a name that goes back much further than that, but I think when we think of it in the context of the modern dive watch template, the late 50s and early 60s, this is an era in which the watch fully kind of came into its own, in my opinion. This watch pulls from that in a few different ways, most prominently with these large broadsword hands and the oversized triangle at 12 o'clock, both of which are present here. But there are a couple of other subtle details that I really enjoy about the dial here as well. First is the wave pattern, which we kind of associate as one of those hallmark traits of the Seamaster 300 today. The modern one expresses this with a laser-etched ceramic dial. Here, though, it doesn't quite hit you in the face as hard. In certain lights, it's even hard to see. It's a much tighter pattern and it blends in with the background overall a little bit better. So it's kind of there to enjoy, but it's not anything that ever becomes annoying when looking at it from certain angles. The next thing is the date application here. Early Seamaster 300 dials that incorporated a date, of course, had the white outline. They've done away with that here, and the date disc is matched to the color of the dial with white printing on it, which I think is the superior way to do it. It's a date window that kind of falls away when you don't need it, but it's there when you do. It doesn't really call attention to itself, and it doesn't compromise the design of the dial at all. And lastly is the small orange tip after the lollipop section of the seconds hand. But there's one other feature that I really associate with this era of Seamaster 300s, and that is this wide scalloped bezel. These are meant to be finger grooves that are easier to grab underwater and manipulate if you need to. I've not gone diving with this watch, but I can say it is relatively easy to use here, and it's a different experience from the more aggressive kind of sawtooth or coinage bezels that we typically associate with dive watches. Speaking of subtle details, the case also offers a lot of subtle details to enjoy here, starting with the twisted lug. Kind of organically comes into the crown guard here on the 3 o'clock side of the case. It doesn't look like a structure that's been added after the fact. It looks like something that was incorporated in a thoughtful way to the design from the get-go. And it kind of presents in a very interesting way here, kind of mounting up to a hill and nesting the crown inside. The crown is still pretty easy to use, even though it sticks out a little bit farther than you might expect for a watch like this, but it doesn't interfere with the wear on the wrist, so no harm, no foul there. I mentioned this is using the Omega caliber 1120, which is a base ETA 2892. And I think that's a good thing. It's something that we are seeing less and less of today in modern tool watches. This was made in an era prior to the whole in-house fad thing, whatever you want to call it, kind of coming into effect, where nowadays it seems like everybody has to have one. Wasn't always the case, and honestly, it's still not the case. If brands want to use movements like this, I think that's just fine. You know exactly what you're getting here. It's going to be easy to service, it's going to be easy to use, and it's going to be quite reliable in the process. It also keeps the price in relatively reasonable territory on these things, both then and now. Now, these watches were typically offered in steel. These titanium references aren't exactly rare, but they're not nearly as common. And I think they too often live in the shadows of many other great Speedmaster 300 references. This one works really well, though. Not only is it light on the wrist, it's a little under 100 grams, so it's not super light, but it's definitely lighter than some of the steel ones. Combined with the shape of this case and the low profile, there's something really magical about how this sits on the wrist, and it makes it just a fantastic daily companion. It also has me thinking, maybe this would have been the better companion to James Bond in some of these movies. These are a lot of small, really amazing details that add up to a watch that's kind of more than the sum of its parts. This is a design that's easily identifiable, and it's one that we closely associate with the kind of 90s era tool watch, for better or worse. You might like that, you might hate it, but it's something that is kind of inescapable from these watches. Whatever your feelings on it, putting this on the wrist, it starts to make a lot more sense. I'm not personally hugely fond of a lot of sport watch designs from the 90s, but when they hit, they really hit. And I think when they work well on the wrist, it just makes them that much more compelling. And speaking of that, this seems to be a formula that some of the mainstream brands have gotten away from in the recent generations. We don't see many watches built like this anymore. Watches have gotten slightly larger and a little more complex, both in terms of their finishing and in terms of the mechanics inside the watch as well. This one is kind of a reference to an era that we'd like to see brought back. Some brands still do this really well. The Zinyu 50 immediately comes to mind, the Pelagos 39, watches like that are kind of in the same vein as this, but it's not something that we really see from Omega these days. And I know the Seamaster 300 is still a very popular watch, and it's built on the foundation of something like this. I'd love to see them come back to their roots a little bit further here. The 90s was a time when tool watches really felt like tool watches, and nowadays they feel like a little bit more than that. Now, you pay a little bit more for them, so maybe you want it to feel like a little bit more than that, but there's something really simple and undeniably charming about this that I would love to see some brands give consideration to. This is well-considered proportions, plenty capable, there's no frills, it's just kind of honest and straightforward. It's an era in execution that's behind us, and sadly, probably not coming back in many ways, but thankfully there's a lot of watches like this that kind of fall into this era that are still out there and still working plenty fine, and thanks to the movements that are inside of them, will still be plenty easy to service and keep utilizing far into the future. But it's hard to deny that I'd love to see Omega do something similar to this with their more modern designs. The closest thing that we've seen is the 60th anniversary Bond Seamaster that is built in the frame of the modern Seamaster 300, but it goes back to this tight wave pattern on the dial, and I think it works really well. Of course, the case is a little bit different there, slightly different dimensions, and there's a magic here that I just have not seen in a Seamaster 300 in a long time. So that's why I appreciate this Seamaster. It's a full titanium, reference 2231.50. Got a lot more of my thoughts on this watch in our full mist review that is now live on Worn and Wound. We'll leave a link to that down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this watch, though. I feel like a lot of people have an association with this generation of Seamaster 300, be it through James Bond or be it through their own watch collection. Where do you fall here? Let us know how you feel about the design of these watches compared to the modern Seamaster 300. Do you like the direction that it's gone? Would you like to see them dial it back into this territory? We'd love to hear from you down in the comments below. Thanks so much for tuning in to this mist review. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. And if you enjoyed this content, please be sure to leave a like and share. It helps us out a lot. Until next time, take care.